Hello, my name is Keshwani. There's Keshwani, Keshwani. We are here because we want to prepare for GRE. We have been solving GRE math problems out of this book here, the official guide to the revised GRE, the second edition. If you do not own this book already, purchase one immediately. You're going to need it. The problem that we're about to solve is the one that you will find on page number 241. Please turn to it. Page 241, and today is our lesson number 341. This problem that you see there on page number 241, problem number 2.9.3 on page 241 is the exact same problem that appeared in the first edition of the revised GRE. We have already solved every single problem from this book. If you're interested in watching the original solution, you will find it on day number 130. Let's see what we can do here. We are given an equation, and we are told that h of x, it's some function here, and they're giving it a name, they're calling this function h. h of x equals absolute value of x. Now, if you don't like h of x and if you want to call it f of x, it's not going to change anything, it's just a name. What does this actually say in English language? Let's find out, shall we? What does this say in English language? What this says is that here, if x happens to be positive, then y is simply equal to x. On the other hand, if x happens to be negative, then y is equal to, what is y equal to in that case? If x happens to be negative, then it equals to -1 times the value of x. The question is, how do we write this thing in the language of mathematics? This is in English language, but this is not how we're going to find in the textbook. What it says, for example, here, what it says is that if when x is equal to 7, then y is equal to 7. On the other hand, if x happens to be negative 7, then y is equal to -1 times the -7. That's what it says. -1 times -7, of course, is positive 7. In other words, we are told that y is equal to absolute value of x, and if x happens to be -7, we have to take the absolute value of -7, and of course, absolute value of -7 is positive 7. The question is, one more time, the question is very simple. How do we write all of this thing, in the language of mathematics? That's the tricky part here. I'm writing all this thing down not because it's very difficult to understand, it's actually a very simple concept, obviously. Question is, how do we express it in the language of mathematics? Let's look at it, shall we? The way we write this in the language of mathematics is, it's like this. We say that y is equal to h of x, and then we go on to explain that this equals to, there are two parts to it. This equals to x for as long as x is positive. Or if it is -1 times x, if x turns out to be negative. That's how we write it in the language of mathematics. Now watch what happens. Even this part that we see at the bottom of the blackboard here, this part right here, even this part is just too verbose. It is too verbose. We have to find more succinct way of expressing this idea. We have to find, I'm not sure about the spelling, if it's spelled incorrectly, don't make a fuss about it. We have to find a more succinct way of expressing this thing, because mathematicians do not like to. You will definitely not find anything like this in the math textbooks. Once in a while, if the author is being nice and he's trying to make you understand something in simple terms, you will find something like this. But in most textbooks, but for most mathematicians, even this way, the second way that we just express it, even this is considered too verbose. It's considered too wordy. They want to express it in a more succinct manner, using mathematical symbols. That's what I'm getting at, using mathematical symbols. So this is one way. This is a layman's way. I don't know if you ever learned that word. We'll come to those words in a second. This is the ordinary simple person's way, the guy on the street, the man on the street, the average person's way, the person who does not have any training in mathematics. This is how he or she will express it in simple words. This is how a mathematician will express it. We'll go one step further, and now we're going to actually write it in the way that you will actually find it in the mathematical textbook. I need the room, so we need to erase this upper part. But what we are about to write, actually let's do it here. It says y equals to h of x, y equals to h of x, which equals to x for as long as x is positive. For as long as x is positive, how do we write it in the using the symbols of mathematics? H of x equals x for as long as x is positive. How do we write that? This is how we write it. We say it equals to x when x is greater than or equal to 0. There you go. When x is greater than or equal to 0 is same as saying for as long as x happens to be positive. And we'll say that h of x equals -1 times the value of x. If x happens to be -5, then the value of y is not -5, but it is -5 times the -1, which makes it a +5, which is what it means to take an absolute value. So it says it equals to -1 times the actual value of x if x happens to be negative. Which we write this in symbols of mathematics as when x happens to be less than 0. There you go. This is how you will find it written in the mathematical textbook, and this is how it is written in the book there in front of you there. So far so good. The very last thing we have to do now is to plot this function. See what shape it takes here when we plot it on the piece of graph. Let's do that up here. Plotting this graph is quite straightforward. What it tells us is that here is our x and here is our y. If x is 0, y is going to be 0. If x happens to be either +1 or -1, y is going to be 1. Because the absolute value of either +1, absolute value of +1 is 1, and absolute value of -1 is also 1. So when x happens to be +1 or -1, the value of y is 1. When x happens to be 2, absolute value of 2 is just 2. But if x happens to be -2, absolute value of -2 is also 2. So whether it's +2 or -2, y is 2. X happens to be +3 or -3, y equals 3, and so on and so forth. Let's plot it here, shall we? Let's see what happens. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's all we need. So when x is 0, when x is 0, y is 0. It begins, our story begins at the origin. That is our first point. When x is 1, y happens to be 1. When x is -1, y happens to be 1 also. When x is 2, y happens to be 2. When x is -2, y also happens to be 2. When x is -3, y is 3, and when x is +3, y is 3. There you go. That's all. That's our graph. That's what the graph looks like. And this graph, as you can see, is made up of two components. This graph is made up of two components. It is made up of two pieces. It's not a line that continues this way or that way. Something like this, a graph like that, is made up of three pieces. There are three pieces here. 1, 2, 3. It is made up of three components. It has two pieces, and which is why it's called such a graph, which has a kink in it. This part here is called the kink. Like you will have a crease in a paper. The kink if it contains a kink, and if it has all of a sudden, if it has a sudden change in slope, that's what this is. This is a sudden change in slope. This is a negatively sloped line, all of a sudden it becomes a positively sloped line. When you have a sudden change in slope, there is a kink there, and it is made up of two pieces, and that is why it is known as, a graph such as this one is known as piecewise function. And that's all there is. That's all there is. The reason we made such a big fuss about the whole thing is to understand this part. Where does this part come from? And what does it mean in simple English language? Well, now we know, because we started out by expressing this idea in a very simple words, in a very simple English language, and then we translated it into the language of mathematics in 2 steps. And this is how it finally turns out to be. It says the h of x, which is the value of y, says y equals to x for as long as x is positive or 0. And if x happens to be negative, then y is going to be -1 times x, which turns it into a positive, which is another way of saying that the value of y is equal to absolute value of x. Alright? I'll see you tomorrow. Bye now.